November 26, 1942. The waters off Guadalcanal, 0341 hours. USS New Orleans, a 588-foot heavy cruiser carrying 900 men, takes a long-lance torpedo from the Japanese destroyer Kagero directly into her forward magazine. The explosion is catastrophic. It detonates the ship's own ammunition stores, and the blast tears away everything forward of turret 2, 24 meters of bow, gone. The ship's number 1 and 2 gun turrets, their crews, the anchor windlass room, officers' quarters, all of it separates from the hull and sinks in the space of seconds. 183 sailors die instantly or drown in the wreckage. Below decks, men who survive the blast find themselves standing at the edge of open ocean where a passageway used to be. What remains is a cruiser with no bow, floating in enemy waters, 600 nautical miles from the nearest fleet repair base at Sydney, Australia. Her draft has shifted forward into open water she was never built to face directly. The ship is still afloat. The engines still turn. The question the crew now faces is not whether New Orleans can be repaired. It's whether a warship with no front third can move under her own power at all. And if she can't, how do you get 8,000 tons of broken steel home without losing what's left of her? By late 1942, the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships had a firm doctrine for catastrophic bow damage. If a torpedo or mine took off more than 15% of a vessel's length forward of the bridge, the standard recommendation was salvage what could be moved, then scrap or rebuild at a major yard. A process that took, on average, 14 to 18 months for a heavy cruiser. The math behind that doctrine wasn't arbitrary. Naval architects at the Bureau, including senior structural engineer Captain Homer N. Wallen, who had overseen much of the salvage work at Pearl Harbor 11 months earlier, understood that a warship's hull is a single stressed structure. The keel, the frames, the deck plating all work together to distribute the ocean's forces across the entire length of the ship. Remove a third of that structure, and the remaining hull faces stresses it was never designed to carry alone. Twisting forces that once traveled the full 588 feet of the ship now concentrate at a single exposed edge. 4 other Allied warships had suffered comparable bow losses earlier in the war. In each case, the vessel was declared unseaworthy for open ocean transit and either scuttled in place or towed at under 4 knots in calm coastal waters, arriving for full reconstruction only after the war-era shipping schedule allowed it, sometimes 20 months later. Towing at higher speeds had been tested once, on a smaller destroyer escort in the Atlantic, and the exposed frame had folded inward within 6 hours, nearly taking the tow line and the tug with it. The immediate problem for New Orleans's captain, Clifford Roper, was starker than doctrine. His ship sat in a combat zone. Japanese aircraft and submarines patrolled the waters around Guadalcanal daily. A cruiser under tow at 4 knots, with no bow and exposed frames, was not a repair problem. It was a target, sitting still in waters, where 3 Allied ships had already been finished off in the preceding 5 months. Sydney's dry docks could rebuild the ship properly, but Sydney was 40 days away by tow, through contested waters the whole way. Nobody in the Bureau of Ships had a doctrine for what came next, because nobody had needed one. The 4 precedent cases had all happened in friendly, defensible harbors. New Orleans did not have that luxury. Commander Harold Dick had spent the 2 years before Guadalcanal not commanding ships, but studying how they broke. Assigned to the Bureau of Ships Salvage and Repair Division, Dick had personally inspected the wreckage at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, cataloging exactly how battleship hulls failed under torpedo and bomb damage, which frames held, which plating sheared, and why. One detail from that inspection stayed with him. The battleship Nevada, despite catastrophic flooding, had been deliberately grounded rather than allowed to sink in the channel. Beaching a wounded hull, he noted, wasn't failure. It was a controllable variable, a choice made under pressure that changed the outcome, rather than a doctrine applied after the fact. That reframing, damage as a set of variables to manage rather than a verdict to accept, became Dick's instinct. He carried it into a habit of asking, whenever a report crossed his desk, not "how bad is the damage," but "which part of this damage can still be controlled?" Colleagues at the Bureau remembered him annotating salvage reports with rough sketches in the margins, working out load paths on paper before anyone asked him to. When news of New Orleans reached the Bureau, he didn't ask whether the ship could be rebuilt in Sydney. He asked whether the crew, using materials already aboard a forward base like Tulagi, could shape a new bow themselves, not a permanent one, but one strong enough to survive open water at speed. Dick had never designed a ship's bow, but he had spent 2 years learning exactly how much structural failure a hull could tolerate before it became fatal, and that number, he believed, was larger than the Bureau's standard doctrine assumed. Dick's proposal was specific: build a temporary bow, a cofferdam, out of coconut logs, scrap steel, and concrete, shaped roughly like a ship's prow, sealed to keep water out, and bolted to what remained of New Orleans's forward frame at Tulagi's makeshift naval base. The resistance wasn't personal. Rear Admiral William Calhoun, in charge of Pacific Fleet logistics, raised the objection that mattered most. Tulagi had no dry dock, no structural engineers on site, and no precedent for fabricating load-bearing hull sections from improvised materials under combat conditions. If the cofferdam failed at sea, the ship and her remaining 700 crew would be lost, with no chance of rescue in submarine heavy waters. Captain Roper's own damage control officers were split. Some argued the flooding had already stabilized the hull's remaining structure into a new equilibrium. Disturbing it with new stress from an attached bow risked reopening fractures in the keel. Others pointed out that leaving the exposed frame unreinforced meant the same risk without any chance of higher speed. Dick's answer was to test the theory before risking the ship. Using salvaged coconut logs cut into structural beams and reinforced with scrap steel plating recovered from the wreck itself, his team at Tulagi built the cofferdam in 21 days, working with no blueprints beyond Dick's own sketches, adjusting the shape by eye against the actual torn edge of the hull. Local timber crews, unfamiliar with naval construction, were taught on the spot how to notch and brace logs to Dick's specifications. Before attaching it permanently, they flooded a test section and monitored the joints under simulated wave pressure for 6 hours. Water intrusion at the seals measured under 2 inches per hour, within what the ship's pumps could handle indefinitely. If you're finding the engineering behind these decisions as compelling as the combat itself, subscribing helps us keep building episodes like this one. The moment the idea nearly died came during final fitting. A support beam cracked under initial load testing, and for several hours, Dick's team believed the entire log structure was undersized for the tonnage it needed to hold. A redesign, adding doubled bracing at the primary stress points, resolved it. But it cost 4 additional days in a harbor within range of Japanese air patrols, days during which 2 reconnaissance flights passed within visual range of the anchored cruiser. December 2nd, 1942. Tulagi Harbor. The cofferdam is bolted into place. New Orleans, missing 24 meters of bow, begins her transit toward Espiritu Santo, then on to Sydney, a total distance of roughly 3,000 nautical miles. And she moves at 6 knots. The crew stations extra lookouts along the exposed forward frame, watching the log and concrete seams for signs of separation. Every 4 hours, damage control teams inspect the joints. The pumps run continuously. Nobody sleeps in the forward berthing compartments. There are none left. Men rotate through 4-hour watches on a structure none of them fully trust, checking bolt tension by hand in the dark. For the first 48 hours, the ship holds course through moderate swells. The cofferdam flexes, but does not crack. On day 3, a joint near the waterline begins seeping at a rate faster than predicted, 6 inches per hour instead of 2. Crews reinforce it underway, wedging additional timber into the gap, while the ship continues moving, working from a rope harness over open water. The historical loss rate for Allied warships attempting open ocean transit with equivalent hull damage based on the 4 prior comparable cases was total. None had survived unassisted transit through contested waters at speeds above 4 knots. New Orleans travels the entire distance to Sydney at speeds up to 6 knots, arriving on December 31, 1942, 29 days after leaving Tulagi. Every member of her surviving crew, approximately 700 men, makes the crossing without further loss. If a warship without a bow can cross 3,000 miles of contested ocean, the question worth asking is what other impossible repairs never got attempted, simply because Doctrine said not to try. That's the kind of question we chase every episode, worth sticking around for. At Sydney's Cockatoo Island dockyard, engineers inspecting the cofferdam on arrival find the coconut log structure had absorbed stresses within roughly 15% of Dick's original calculations, close enough that the design, born from sketches and salvaged material, had performed almost exactly as intended. One engineer's report described the timber joints as worn but sound, noting no structural member had failed outright across the full 3,000-mile transit. The human cost sits on both sides of the ledger. 183 American sailors died in the initial explosion, most of them in the forward compartments that sank within seconds. Aboard Kagero, the destroyer that fired the torpedo, no casualties are recorded for that engagement. She would be sunk 7 months later by Allied aircraft near New Guinea, taking most of her crew with her. New Orleans underwent full reconstruction at Sydney, receiving a new welded steel bow, and returned to active Pacific service by August 1943, participating in operations through the end of the war, including the bombardment of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and surviving to be present in Tokyo Bay for the Japanese surrender in September 1945. Commander Dick's improvised cofferdam technique became a documented Bureau of Ships procedure, applied at least twice more before 1945 to other Pacific Fleet vessels suffering comparable bow damage, cutting average return-to-service time for such damage from over a year to a matter of months. The reframing fact is this: the coconut log bow that carried New Orleans 3,000 miles was never designed to be strong. It was designed to be strong enough, for 29 days, in specific seas, at a specific speed, and not 1 hour longer. The Navy's engineers hadn't discovered a permanent solution. They had discovered how much impossible was actually just untested.